Stay with us. We continue now from Washington with Michael Morrell, the former acting director and deputy director of the CIA. We want to talk about Russian hacking and other issues. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Good to be with you, Charlie, always.
You have said some interesting things. First of all, you described the Russian hacking and the interference in our election as the political equivalent of 9/11. And you have described hacking as an attack on our very democracy. I assume that there is no doubt in your mind, and you accept the various intelligence agencies who have said that Russia was hacking with an intent to create chaos or something other motive in our political election.
Yeah, Charlie, I think it's important to kind of break down, what we know for sure here and, what we don't know, and what we think. And, we know with certainty that the U.S. intelligence community, the entire community, all of the agencies, said back in October that the Russians were interfering in our election. This was a statement put out by the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, that the Russians were trying to interfere in our election through hacking, and that there was little doubt in the minds of the intelligence community that the knowledge of this, if not the direction of it, went to the highest levels of the Russian government. So we know that back in October, the intelligence community thought that for sure. What's new here in the last few days is not an official statement by the government, but a series of leaks. And it looks from those leaks as if the Central Intelligence Agency, the group of people that I used to run, not only believe that the Russians were interfering in the election, but they were doing so with the intent to undermine Secretary Clinton and to help Donald Trump. It doesn't sound to me as if the rest of the intelligence community is there yet with that judgment. But it's not unusual, Charlie, for the CIA to lead the rest of the community and for the rest of the community to eventually catch up.
Why do you say that?
It's just what has been tradition. It's just what is typical. CIA is quicker to make judgments than other agencies. It tends to lead the community in the judgments that it makes. So it just tends to what happened over time. One of the things, Charlie, that really caught my attention in the leak that happened last Friday, the piece that ran in the Washington Post, was it said that not only does the CIA believe that it was the intent of the Russians to help Trump, but that the CIA believed this with high confidence. And that really caught my attention because the CIA does not attach a high confidence label to an analytic judgment without an awful lot of confidence. That is the highest confidence level there is, high confidence. It usually indicates that there is not just one source of information, but many sources of information. It means that it is not a circumstantial case, but a direct case. So it sounds to me like the CIA's got some pretty compelling information here that has led it to this judgment.
I assume that's part of the reason that the president has launched an investigation to find out exactly what we do know by calling on all agencies that might have some information, to coordinate all that information so you can make a judgment of what happened and why.
Yeah, so I think he's really, so he obviously knows what the intelligence community believes and what the CIA believes because he's receiving that on a daily basis. I think what he's trying to do here by January 20th is to pull together the two different streams that are underway in the U.S. government. One is what's going on in the intelligence community and what they're collecting and what they think and what they're learning. The other is a criminal probe by the FBI into the hacking. Which would not be as crystal clear to everybody else. Since it's a criminal probe, it gets closed off. And so what I think he wants to do is bring everything together that everybody knows so that we have a complete understanding of exactly what happened.
Here is one of the things that have been reported, that the FBI does not necessarily, has not come to the conclusion, as you just suggested, with one reason, have not come to a conclusion that it was with the intent of promoting the election of Donald Trump. it is sometimes cited that the reason for that is that the notion that they believe that both the Democrats and the Republicans' national committees were hacked, but information damaging to Hillary Clinton was the only one that was released to WikiLeaks.
Right. So what you see in these leaks is that's the key reason, Charlie, that's given for why the CIA believes that it was the intent to help Trump and hurt Clinton, was because why didn't they release damaging stuff about Trump and the Republicans, right? I think that's probably true. That's probably part of the analyst's thinking, but that's inferential, that's circumstantial. I think the analysts have more. I think they've got sources of information that are telling them exactly what the intent was, that go beyond just an inference, that go beyond just the forensics, right? Because the computer forensics can tell you that it was Russia, but the computer forensics can't take you to intent. So I think there's some pretty good information here that has led the CIA to believe this.
And why do you think the president-elect is rejecting this?
I think largely, I have two theories, right? Theory number one is believing it, right? Believing this raises questions about the legitimacy of his election. And obviously, that's the last thing he wants to do. So his natural instinct is just to reject the premise.
Right.
I think he also believes, Charlie, that, and this is based on some things that he has said and based on some things that Kellyanne Conway has said, but I think he believes that the Central Intelligence Agency may be political. And, you know, from his, it's very interesting, Charlie, to look at this from his perspective, right? So from his perspective, he sees, number one, he sees Mike Hayden, a former director. He sees Michael Morrell, a former deputy director and acting director, as having criticized him extensively during the campaign. That's kind of number one. He looks at that and he kind of makes him wonder about the whole organization, right, when two former senior leaders have come out so aggressively against him. So that's one. Two is, right after the convention, he has his first intelligence briefing. And within 24 to 48 hours of that intelligence briefing, there are leaks about what happened at the briefing. And those leaks about what happened at the briefing are not positive about him, right? That he didn't ask any questions, that Mike Flynn was aggressive, and Chris Christie had to counsel Mike Flynn to be quiet, right? All these stories came out. And if you're the president-elect, you have to wonder, where did these stories come from? They could have come from only one place, right? The intelligence community. So you wonder about the political nature of the intelligence community, right? So I think he kind of puts all that together, and he sees CIA as a political organization with a political agenda, and that could not be further from the truth, Charlie. It is directly the opposite. The Central Intelligence Agency, as you know, is apolitical, it's nonpartisan, it's very ethos. It's the strongest tenet in the place is call them like you see them, no matter its impact on politics, no matter its impact on policy.
But you also know the following. Michael Flynn, who is the nominee to be the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, has been considered a very good intelligence official within the military, working for the Joint Chiefs and also working for Stan McChrystal in Afghanistan. He has written about the politicization of the CIA, and he's the person who was in Donald Trump's ear as candidate and as president-elect.
Right. So he's probably right. If Donald Trump believes that the Central Intelligence Agency is politicizing this judgment, then in part it's because Mike Flynn is whispering that in his ear. Absolutely right. Talk about briefings, because this president-elect has chosen not to receive briefings every day.
What's the value of a presidential daily briefing, the PDB? And are you astounded that this president-elect has said, you know, I don't need to do that every day. I can have other people listen and they can report to me?
Yeah. So it's a great question, Charlie. So I think you have to start with the proposition that we are at a very unique time in the history of national security issues in this country. I don't think we've had a time when the number of national security issues facing the United States of America is as great as it is today. There have been times in our history, Charlie, where that have been more dangerous. War of 1812, Civil War, periods during the Cold War, World War II, World War I, obviously. But the sheer number of issues facing us today is staggering. That's kind of point number one. Point number two is that the vast majority of those issues, Charlie, are first and foremost intelligence issues, meaning you cannot understand those issues, you can't make policy on them, and you can't carry out that policy without first-rate intelligence. And you put those two propositions together, staggering number of issues, all of them intelligence issues, and you come to a really important point that intelligence has never been more important than it is today. Let me give you an example. You can't understand the Iranian nuclear program, the status of the Iranian nuclear program without first-rate intelligence. You can't understand the North Korean long-range missile program without first-rate intelligence. You can't understand Chinese military modernization without first-rate intelligence. You need intelligence to really understand those issues. So intelligence is critically, critically important. And that's why the last two presidents, President Bush and President Obama, have been huge consumers of intelligence because they understand its importance. I think the president said just the other day, right, you can't understand these issues without reading that PDB every day. And so I think that the president-elect is missing a huge opportunity here by not reading the PDB during the transition. He's missing a huge opportunity to learn everything he can about these issues so that when he becomes president and he needs to start making decisions, there'll be a substantive context in which he will be making those decisions. So I think he's just missing a huge opportunity.
Let's assume all these intelligence agencies back in October understood that the Russians were behind the hacking of, let's say, Anthony Podesta, Podesta, who was a chairman of the Clinton campaign, understood the Democratic National Committee hacking by Russia. It got to the point where he said, we will respond proportionately, appropriately, or I've forgotten the exact words. You would have assumed that the election is over now and that message would have been sent. But do we assume it has or not?
So my view, Charlie, is that, and the reason I called this the political equivalent of 9/11, handful of reasons I did that. The most important reason was that I think this is a significant attack on the United States. That a foreign government interfering with our election for whatever intent. Right? I don't think the intent here is as important as the fact that they were doing it, that they were interfering in our election. The fact that a foreign government was interfering in our election is a huge, huge issue. And I'm really surprised that it hasn't gotten as much attention as it has. It just literally the last few days. As I said, this is an attack on our democracy. This is an attack on who we are as a people. So that's why I said this is the political equivalent of 9/11. It's also really interesting to me, Charlie, that we were in a sense just as surprised about this as we were about 9/11. If you think about what the 9/11 Commission said about 9/11, right, it was a failure of imagination, that we couldn't imagine that the terrorists would take the particular approach they did. What's interesting in this case is I don't think the government imagined that the Russians would ever do this. When people talked about cyber threats, they talked about the Chinese stealing industrial information. They talked about the threat to electrical grids. They talked about the threat to our telecommunications and to our finances. Nobody talked about a cyber information operations kind of threat to our elections. So there was a little bit of a missing imagination when it came to what happened to us here. So this is a huge issue. So I think that the United States government has a responsibility, Charlie, to respond and respond proportionally. And because this attack is so significant, right, it's leading people to question whether it's leading people to question the very legitimacy and sanctity of this election. So it's a huge deal. So I think there has to be two kind of parameters on how we respond. One is, I think, Charlie, it has to be overt. It has to be seen, okay? Because if it's not seen, then, because it's not only the Russians who are watching here how we're going to respond. It's also the Chinese. It's also the Iranians. It's also the North Koreans. It's all sorts of people who are watching how is the United States going to respond. And if we respond covertly in a way that nobody else can see, then you lose that deterrent effect on everybody else. That's number one. Number two is it has to be significant from Vladimir Putin's perspective. It has to be painful to him. It has to hurt. So when people talk about indicting a handful of Russians who might have been behind this, Russians who will never, ever want to travel to the United States or even ever leave Russia, right? That's a slap on the wrist. When people talk about sanctions on Russian intelligence organizations or individual Russians who work for those intelligence organizations who might have been behind this, that's a slap on the wrist, right? This needs to be significant. And it doesn't need to be in the cyber realm, right? This can be, our response can be and perhaps should be outside of the cyber realm. But we need to do something that is significant from Putin's perspective, and it needs to be visible to the entire world, and we need to respond to it. And if we don't respond, it's simply going to embolden him. And quite frankly, Charlie, it is the Obama administration's responsibility to respond because this happened on their watch. And I'm very concerned, Charlie, that this is going to slip through the cracks of the transition. In a very similar way to the fact that the U.S. didn't respond to the Cole attack in October of 2000. That slipped through the cracks of the Clinton-Bush transition. And the United States ended up not responding to a very significant al-Qaeda attack on the United States, in this particular case on the USS Cole in Yemen. I think this is a big deal, Charlie, and I think people need to pay attention to it.
Okay, so hearing you say that, what would be a proportionate response that would get his attention?
I'll give you two, Charlie, because I can't think of five, but I'll give you two. Right. One would be broad-based, deep economic sanctions. The kind of sanctions that we put on the Iranians, the kind of sanctions that brought the Iranians to the negotiating table, the kind of sanctions that said to companies and banks around the world that if you do business with the Iranians, so in this case, if you do business with the Russians, you cannot do business with American corporations. Boy, that would get the attention of Vladimir Putin. And we might even be able, I mean, when people raise this, they say, geez, we won't be able to get the Europeans to go along with us. Well, there's already signs that Russia is already trying to meddle in the German election. So we may be able to get the Europeans to come along with us here, but we should at least try.
That's one.
That's one, right? Two would be to provide offensive weapons to the Ukrainians. We have been very reluctant to do that. Putin is dead set against it. It would send a very powerful signal not only about the election, but our support for the Ukrainians and the defense of their nation. So that's two examples of what would capture his attention.
Michael Morrell, thank you so much. Have happy holidays.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. For more about this program and early episodes, visit us online at